I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Rahul Gehani is a partner and co-head of Pricing Assurance Team. And joining Rahul are Abhishek Biswas, Udit Maheshwari, and Chitika Ujjain, who are all practice directors within the Pricing Assurance Team. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Rahul.
Thank you. And hi, very warm welcome to all the participants in today's webinar. Uh, the IT and BPO outsourcing industry has been through 8 quarters of slow growth. During this time, resiliency of the industry has been tested. Buyers' decision making has gone through a significant change, and providers have had to pull various levers to tide through the tough times. In the webinar today, we will uncover the key commercial trends witnessed in outsourcing deals in the first half of 2024, and also what the implications for the second half are. So for today's agenda, we will essentially go through three broad points. Firstly, a quick recap of some of the interesting recent market developments. Moving on then to observations that we have on buyer expectations and open questions as well. Thirdly, how can enterprises maximize the value in their outsourcing and cloud SaaS deals? With this context, as we move on to the next page, let's recap what we observed in H1. So from the perspective of buyers, 2024 has been a pretty tough year in general. At a high level, there are four important things to keep in mind around the market trends. First, when it comes to software products, there is a very high degree of change in the product roadmaps that vendors have introduced or are in the process of currently introducing, forcing buyers to make difficult decisions around the choice of the software products that they ultimately procure. For instance, the SAP ECC support end date is nearing, and buyers are forced to move to either S/4HANA or some other ERP. Or if you take the example of Viva, it is moving away from Salesforce as its CRM platform, and it will move towards having its own CRM platform going ahead. Hence, life sciences clients have had to make a decision whether to stick with Viva or not. There are also vendors who have got onto the generative AI bandwagon and are offering add-ons in addition to the modules or products that buyers have already purchased. And very frequently, these add-ons come with a hefty additional licensing fee. All of this has happened at a time when the global economy is still close to recession, and the slowdown in the products or services that end client organizations are offering, is also very much perceptible. As a result, to maintain profits, buyers are forced to stay within tightened budgets for technology services, as well as BPO services. Finally, it has been roughly about 1.5 years since the advent of generative AI. There's hardly any medium or large sized buyer that has not got into generative AI pilot projects. And there are barely a handful, where generative AI has actually been deployed at scale in production. As a result, there's a lot of fatigue when it comes to generative AI pilot projects. Let us have a detailed look now at some of these trends, I'll ask my colleague Udit, Udit, you are the expert in this area. So how have the economics for cloud and SaaS platforms impacted clients?
Right. So Rahul, in terms of SaaS providers, right? So what we have observed is organizations across industries and geographies are facing significant challenges when it comes to managing their SaaS costs, right? So almost all major software providers have publicly announced an increase, or they've already increased the prices of their software offering in the last 12 to 18 months. And the ones that have not already increased their prices are planning to do so in the next couple of quarters. So taking some examples, for instance, IBM increased their prices for IaaS offering by a whopping 25%, right? Similarly, Salesforce last year increased the prices of all of their products by an average of 9%. Although this price increase by Salesforce was the first in the last 7 years, the impact on the customers was huge. Similarly, Adobe, HubSpot, and others have increased their prices by an average of 8 to 10%. Microsoft, who happens to be, one of those biggest software providers who are prevalent in almost every organization, they have publicly announced that they'll be increasing the prices of their Dynamics product by up to 17% starting October 2024. So net, all of the enterprise customers are facing strong cost pressures from their software providers. And hence they ponder what is the reason behind such steep price increases by the software vendors. So the software vendors often justify their price increases, attributing it to their continuous product innovation, increasing the functionalities and features that their products offer. The second and the most important reason, of course, is every software vendor is also looking after their business profitability, and hence they want to get as much revenue as possible from their customers. The other reason is the software providers themselves are facing cost pressures because of increasing cost of energy. So the data center hosting cost, etc., has gone up, which is why the cost has translated into increasing prices. If we move to the next slide, we'll see that it's not only the cost that the enterprise customers have to manage when it comes to their SaaS or cloud offering or cloud consumption. It's also how these offerings are being bundled that the enterprise customers has to manage. So for instance, Broadcom recently acquired VMware, and there is a lot of buzz in the market around what has changed in VMware, and practically everything has changed in VMware offering, right from how the products are being offered to the customers now or going forward, how they'll be offered, to what would be the pricing impact. So for example, VMware used to have approximately 9,000 SKUs, which is now being consolidated into two primary bundles, which is VCF, VMware Cloud Foundation, and VMware vSphere Foundation. So while it has simplified the product offering, it's not as simple as it looks, right? Initially or earlier, the products, VMware products, were available as perpetual licenses, but going forward, they'll only be available as subscription. While it's a good news for the customers who want to start small and pay only for what they use, test and then grow, for bigger customers it might just increase the overall cost of ownership. The third and most important change that Broadcom is making to VMware offering is now they're moving the charging metrics away from processor to core based charging. And it's not only the move from processor to core, it's also the mandate to buy at least licenses for 16 cores and for minimum of 2 processors. So any customers who's using high compute infrastructure, they would need to buy more licenses, and hence the overall cost might just balloon up, right? And while Broadcom has announced all of this, the customers are already making efforts to understand what is it that they can do to negotiate better deals with Broadcom. And one of the levers is the discounting structure. So now customers can look up to at least 9 to 35% discount, depending upon what is their overall book value or what is their overall business with VMware. So net, it's not only just the price pressure, but also to understand how the products are being bundled by cloud providers or SaaS providers that the enterprise customers need to be wary of. Shitika, what are some of the criteria which are being followed by the enterprise customers to drive maximum value from outsourcing contracts?
Right, Udit. So the criteria and buyer priorities are ever evolving. And in fact, it's really interesting to see how quick the market dynamics end up shaping the buying criteria globally, in fact. So while evaluating recent deals, we have seen that reinforced focus on deriving maximum value from outsourcing contracts, and several key factors are now considered by buyers when taking any kind of sourcing decision. The first and foremost, buyer priority is back on pricing. And here we are not only talking about cost saving initiatives, but it's also about meeting broader financial and strategic objectives of the company. The next being solution design and delivery model, which kind of includes any kind of assessment on the proposal solutioning, whether it aligns to the buyer needs or not. And this includes examination of the entire organization structure, the governance model that will drive the right behavior from the service providers, so on and so forth. So this aspect is crucial because it can significantly influence the commercial terms and the overall success of any project. The next being service provider capability. It's important to evaluate the provider experience and expertise. And buyers are looking beyond the case studies and references that are typical to RFP process, right? But now the quality and relevance of these references are key importance. It can be the key factor in deciding the potential success of the entire engagement in itself. So this becomes really crucial for providers to kind of put on priority in terms of what should be the right focus. One often overlooked factor is the strategic alignment part, and this involves ensuring that both parties have a compatible goal and objective alignment in place. Call it a behavioral or a cultural alignment, but we always advise upon the fact that paying attention on how flexible and transparent the provider is in their interactions is very important, and this can really impact the effectiveness of the partnership overall. And finally, consider risk associated with any transitioning work, even with any kind of extensive analysis or mathematical modeling. The decision often comes down to choosing the path with the least amount of risk. So, yeah, net, while concrete matrices are important, these broader strategic considerations are becoming very crucial in making successful sourcing decisions. So, with that context on the evolving buying criteria, Abhishek, do you want to share your perspective on the market movement in general?
Sure, Shatika. And thanks for bringing that up. It's an interesting perspective, which somewhat echoes with what we talked about as being the first criteria around pricing. So, as is pretty evident from both the graphs that we have on screen right now, the overall market sentiment has been that of a slowdown. Now, irrespective whether it's an industry-wide revenue trend or a geography-wise revenue trend, so over the last multiple quarters, we have consistently seen a downward trend. Now, while this is one of the primary drivers in terms of the overall revenue slowing down, which is impacting not just the pricing, but also the buyer sentiment in terms of trying and finding newer and more means to, reduce their overall spend, reduce pricing, and so on. But having said that, as you can see, everything is not so gloomy. There have been some upshoots, especially from a sector wise. If we talk about the tech, media, and telecom sector over the past quarter, that sector has bucked the trend and has shown an upward movement. And on similar lines, North America as a geography, that is showing some positive signs of upward movement. So hopefully things are looking to improve. But yes, at an overall level, the market sentiment is bit related to a slowdown of the movement. Now, on similar lines, if we build on the next area that we have, which is around the pricing trends over the last 12 months, and if we can move to the next slide. So quite similar to how the market sentiment is, if we talk about the pricing trends over the last 12 months, as you can see, like irrespective of the service area, whether it's application services, whether it's infrastructure services or BPO services, the net price change has been more or less been flattest. There has not been, I mean, the typical price increases that we saw like a couple of years back, wherein most of the providers were going ahead with significant price increases across the board. That trend has definitely gone away. More or less, it's a flattest change, whether you talk about an onshore geography like US, or if you talk about offshore regions like India, Philippines. Across the board, the rate cards have seen increased pressure, which has in turn led to the providers keeping a flattest change. And in some cases, we have also seen degrowth happening, which essentially is like there has been decline in the FT rates also. Uh, Rahul, in your opinion, what do you feel are some of the main reasons why the output-based pricing model also ends up showing a price decline apart from FTE reduction?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we get this question very frequently, from enterprises and service providers. I think three main reasons. The first one is, which is very important even in the current situation, is increasing offshoring. In fact, there was a question which we've just addressed on the chat mode around the offshoring part. Uh, while offshoring levels have generally, become fairly high, for all mature services, we still see efforts from service providers as well as acceptance from enterprises to take them up even higher, because it's a very strong lever to contain costs, to reduce costs, and the efficacy of this has been proven over so many years by now. So in general, there is a very high acceptance of this. Combined with the second lever, which is around automation. So the last few years, automation has really become one of the most important parts of the solutions which service providers are bringing to the table. A key impact of it is essentially effort reduction and therefore pricing reduction, combined with the third element of standardized resolution. So that's something also which providers are trying to push in a lot of the deals that we are currently seeing. Having covered the pricing trends, I think it also makes sense to talk a bit about transition. Shitika, what are your observations on how transition has evolved?
Right, Rahul. So, providers are facing increasing scrutiny to cut prices and provide value for their clients. And in such scenarios, transition services become a key focus area because providers get to demonstrate their ability to deliver not just cost saving, but also greater efficiency and value to the customer. While transition fee amortization has been a general practice, we are seeing an increase in instances of complete or partial waiver of transition fee. And especially this is seen in competitive deal scenarios. Rahul, do you reckon we do a quick poll with our audiences now? And to be honest, I'm really interested to see how our audiences perceive the impact of Gen AI.
Yep, absolutely. So the question for the audience is, what percentage of Gen AI-led productivity gains are your providers proposing in application development projects? 5 to 10%, 10 to 15%, 15 to 30%, 30 to 40, and more than 40. While the audience is polling, just want to also check with Abhishek. Any high-level perspective, Abhishek, that you can share on what are the functions seeing maximum leverage of Gen AI when it comes to IT infra services?
Definitely an interesting thought process, Rahul. While we do see that the talk of Gen AI is everywhere, right? Whether it's data center managed services or workplace or service desk. But at the end of the day, predominantly what we are seeing is the use cases which are being leveraged or being proposed. They primarily revolve around two of the areas, one being digital workplace services and the second one being service desk. So I guess right now, at present, these are the two areas which are seeing most of the Gen AI leverage from an infrastructure perspective.
Got it. Thanks. Okay, and I think we have the results of the poll. So 148 people participating. 28% say that the productivity gains expected in application development projects are 15 to 30%. Equal number of people saying 10 to 15%, and just a tad bit lower saying it is 0 to 10%. So essentially, you could say that 75, 80% of people saying that the gains could be anywhere between 0 to 30%. Shitika, you are the expert in this area. What's your reaction to this?
So indeed, a very close call, Rahul, and a true reflection on how we are seeing Gen AI impact being perceived in the market in general. So just to give the perspective on the actual trend, we are broadly seeing the proposed benefit of Gen AI for application development projects to be in the range of 15 to 30%. So I think most of the audiences got that right. Service providers have been using Copilot tools for AD services for quite some time now. And documentation of requirements is one key area that is getting optimized by Gen AI. In fact, in testing, the most notable impact of Gen AI is in the test case generation or even synthetic data generation. And of course, this goes beyond saying that as the technology scales up, we anticipate the productivity to be even higher in the near future. So, yeah, over to you, Rahul.
All right. Moving ahead. So next we'll look at what are the observations that we have around buyer expectations, and also what are some of the questions that are still open, and we are trying to find the answers to. So the first such observation is basically around generative AI. No prizes for guessing that. Essentially, buyers are becoming more impatient with regard to the implementation of generative AI in production in their environments. Uh, you know, uh, in general, as you can see on the chart on the left, more than 85% of the POCs have failed to move to production. Um, and the number of POCs that essentially we kind of looked at was a pretty high number, more than 2,500 POCs. So a very valid reason for buyers feeling a bit of fatigue when it comes to Gen AI pilots. The broad observations is that clients are really interested in, first of all, implementing generative AI. In many cases, they are not able to identify the use cases themselves, or how exactly to do the execution for those use cases and move them into production. Hence, they are seeking a lot of help from service providers. But at the same time, it's not really happening at the pace that they would like, and hence, the fatigue or the low patience at present, around pilots. Now, specifically, the third point that we like to talk about is, even if we kind of focus on IT services or BPO services and how generative AI can up the game, or up the business case, for a particular initiative. Clients are clearly expecting the providers to come up with a very well articulated point of view, which helps different stakeholders within the client organization really contribute to the decision of whether they should go ahead with the generative AI elements as part of the IT or the BPO solution, or are they better off not including it, And for that, they would require different levels of information, For example, some of the executive stakeholders would need to know that what is the overall spend reduction that's going to come because of generative AI inclusion in the solutions. What will be the ROI when it comes to investing in the generative AI part of the solution? What impact it's going to have on the overall employee experience or the user experience? So those are some very key questions. The program leaders or the line managers in client organizations also need to know some very specific details. For example, what is the productivity improvement that Gen AI will drive? Or what are the effort reduction that we're kind of talking about because of generative AI execution? What is the kind of ticket elimination ratio that we are kind of looking at due to Gen AI? These are very important questions. Buyers need to ask for clarity around these, and providers would do well to actually articulate their proposition in exactly these lines in order to expedite the movement towards Gen AI utilization. Abhishek, it is expected that introduction of Gen AI could also drive pricing model changes in IT and BPO services. But as of now, what are some of the important trends that you are seeing as far as pricing models are concerned?
Yeah, yes, Rahul. And it's not just Gen AI which is actually leading to the change in some of the commercial model adoptions that we see, but in general, there has been growing movement, especially from the enterprise side, in evaluating and adopting newer models. So, if we talk about application services or cloud services, for example, up till a few years back, the two main pricing models that we know about is essentially T&M based pricing model or a fixed fee kind of a pricing model. Both of these models were almost 50 or more, like 50% or more of the deals were adopting this kind of pricing model. But then what we have increasingly seen across both the services in recent times is there has been a growing shift towards adopting the newer age models. And in fact, the T&M and fixed fee pricing model adoption has in fact dropped down to below 40% in both the cases. Now, one of the key reasons or one of the key factors driving this adoption from the enterprise side is often with a T&M or a fixed fee kind of a model, the enterprises struggled with accountability in terms of what went into the pricing from the provider side, how to hold the providers accountable, and which is effectively why they are leveraging to newer age models. So some of them like outcome-based models or a output-based RU model. And in fact, one of the interesting models in cloud services, the percentage of cloud spend managed, that has picked up quite a lot, as we can see, right? From 8% some years back to now almost 15% of the cloud services deals adopting the cloud spend model. So definitely, and we expect that going forward, this trend would continue. In fact, I would like to ask Sitika, right? Apart from some of these innovative commercial models that we are seeing in the market, right? In your experience, what are some of the other factors that you've seen influence recent deal wins that we've seen?
Yes, Abhishek. And definitely some interesting market shift happening towards evolving commercial models there. Now, when it comes to other factors, even simple solutioning aspect like location selection, we are seeing a noticeable leverage of tier two cities like Jaipur, Coimbatore, Bhubaneswar, Kochi. And historically, the deployment of teams in tier two cities was more a hybrid approach. Providers would typically base most of the core team in tier one cities and then shift some operational tasks to tier two locations. However, that is now changing, and there's a shift in the approach. In fact, in contemporary deals, it's becoming more common to see the entire delivery team based out of tier two cities. For instance, one of the recent proposals for a European financial services firm, one of the Indian heritage providers proposed using a tier two locations entirely, which resulted in highly competitive pricing for them and put them in a very favorable position in the selection process. Now, one caveat is that this is mostly seen in cost conscious and mid-size RFPs rather than very large scale projects or transformation nature projects. Because in the end, scalability in tier two locations or tier three locations is still a challenge for most of the providers. Rahul, you have been leading some of the vendor consolidation exercises we advised on in the recent past, and would like to understand what are your observations pertaining to these.
Yes, Shatika. So there are a couple of interesting observations on that. So in 2022, we saw a lot of vendor consolidation deals within a particular function. For example, consolidation of vendors in the IT application space. Uh, you know, but in 2023, we kind of saw that kind of picking up steam and cutting across different functions as well. So for example, there were quite a few total IT deals, where the scope was essentially IT applications as well as IT infrastructure services for the end client. And while both those types of deals are visible even now, there are also now a different type of deals that are getting more visible, which are basically have an integrated BPO plus the full IT stack, as part of the deal scope. As an example, we recently worked with a large energy client that had already outsourced its entire IT to one service provider and certain parts of finance and accounting and human resources processes to another provider. And it was now looking to consolidate, across these two providers. The key motivations were essentially, to unlock synergies in the solution, synergies in the commercials themselves, and drive improved performance and user experience. Now, this is not really an isolated kind of an example. If you kind of look at the chart on the left side, the prevalence of these kind of integrated IT plus BPO deals is kind of going up. As of now, the number is roughly 3x of what it was about 3 years back. Let us take another example of such a deal on the next slide. So this slide essentially, talks about another case study, where the client was essentially a US headquartered manufacturing company. And it had outsourced parts of its BPO and IT services. So for example, parts of the HR onboarding process were outsourced to a service provider. And on the IT side, provisioning of, devices, portal access, network for all the new joinees. That was one of the key functions as far as the IT outsourcing scope was concerned. The problem that it was facing was that there were frequent delays in the provisioning of the devices, equipments, network, etc., etc. Now, that basically was leading to low employee satisfaction, and a lot of escalations happening, a lot of tickets being raised. In this case, the client decided to consolidate the services outsourced across IT and BPO. And over a period of time, some very clear benefits were visible. For example, the number of L2 escalations due to delays in provisioning reduced by 20%. It also helped in rationalizing the effort and the costs going into such areas where a single vendor had control over a part of the process, which was earlier divided into two vendors. And very importantly, the satisfaction score among the employees also showed a material rise, of about 12%. So just goes to show that it's a very important thing to keep track on, and going forward, we expect that such kind of deals might increase even further. Now, the other thing that we also are seeing is, a lot of enterprises looking at, benchmarking the entire contract that they have to drive better value from contracts. So moving on, Shritika, is that something that you want to share some observations on?
Yes, Rahul. We are in fact seeing more frequent requests for contract benchmarking than before. And of course, this goes beyond just price benchmarking. Buyers typically go for a complete assessment of the contract nowadays. That includes assessment of solution and sizing, delivery metrics, terms and conditions, performance benchmarking, so on and so forth. And the idea is to align the best possible to the market standards that are there. At times, these are also exercises done with the sole purpose of realigning the existing contract to the market, because a fresh RFP process followed by a new contract rollout requires time and comes at a significant cost for clients. And the savings comes in many forms. It's just not cost saving. Sometime in the recent past, we advised a pharma client around their existing shoring strategy, the COLA contracting mechanism that was there, the terms and conditions around IP, solicitation, liability clauses, which ended up generating not only cost saving, which was, again, cost saving was the primary driver due to the restructuring of the shoring strategy as such, but it also led to giving them a balanced contract in place. So, Udit, we have spoken so far about the buyer expectations evolving in the market, but what's your point of view around some of the open questions that are still there? We might find some answers, but what's your point of view on that?
Yes. So, Shrutika, like we discussed in the previous pages, while there are a lot of areas where we finally have an answer, there are some areas wherein, enterprise customers are still looking for answers. So, for instance, given the market complexities, will it work in favor of the service providers, or will it work in favor of the customers? Will it increase the overall cost of ownership, or will it decrease the cost of ownership? Similarly, like we saw in the poll as well, right? So, what is the quantifiable productivity impact of Gen AI initiatives, right? Is it 0% to we saw that, our attendees are seeing it between 0 to 30%, right? So what is it that is purely attributable to Gen AI? Similarly, for software deals, how would the deal economics work for enterprises and providers, right? So these are still some of the questions wherein we need to find answers. And just for the information of our attendees, we at Everest Group are already working towards finding answers to these questions. And if anybody needs support, they can of course reach out to us post this webinar, and we'll be happy to support you, right? With that, I think we will move to the next segment of our webinar, wherein which is the last segment of the webinar. And here we'll discuss what enterprises can do to maximize value in their outsourcing contracts as well as cloud or SaaS-based contracts. So talking about cloud contracts, right? So while the cloud contracts are very complex, or they look very complex, there are still some levers that enterprise customers can use or deploy in order to get better deals from their cloud providers or hyperscalers. Some of the levers, I'll talk briefly about some of the levers. So, for example, adopting lean provisioning, which essentially means eliminating zombie assets, or the assets which practically have very low or no utilization, and establishing a process of continuously cleaning up the infrastructure that we use. Also, standardizing the instances used and switching to cheaper versions wherever possible. The next lever is switching to cloud native design, which essentially means introducing horizontal auto scaling for workloads wherever it is applicable. The next is assessing any cost spikes. So once an enterprise has already embarked on the cloud journey, once they have stabilized, they should keep on continuously assessing their bills from their hyperscalers, just to identify if there are any sudden cost spikes, and then dig deeper into what are the reasons behind these cost spikes. Then the next lever is consolidating idle resources. So here, what enterprises can do is probably turn off the resources when they're not in use, essentially the dev and test environment. So when they're not in use, the test environment specifically, they can be deallocated. Then using spot instances or programmatic discounts. So not almost all of the hyperscalers have programmatic discounts. For example, they have reserved instances. They offer discounts based on the capacity that an enterprise customer reserves upfront. So customers should assess their demand for these infrastructure units, and then also try and reserve the capacities in advance to gain benefit from the discounted per unit rates that hyperscalers offer. In addition to managing the cloud contracts, in the next slide, we'll see a case example wherein there are some levers that I'll talk about that enterprise customers can use to negotiate with Microsoft, right? So if you could move to the next slide, please. Sorry, the previous one. Yeah. So here what we're seeing, so like I spoke last time, right? Microsoft has publicly announced that they're increasing the prices of their Dynamics 365 product by up to 17%. So the graphs in the first half of the slide represent the percentage increase in different products of Microsoft Dynamics 365 suite. So the increase is somewhere about 17%, right? So what are some of the levers that enterprise customers can use right away? Is one, exercising their clause for price protection. So what we have seen in most of the contracts with Microsoft, customers already have a price protection clause, and this clause essentially protects customers from any midterm increases in the prices that a software vendor, here Microsoft, does to their product, right? So if the customers already have this clause in their Microsoft contract, all they need to do is exercise this clause so that they do not see the price impact immediately in October 2024, and then they get time to renegotiate their prices only when the contract is due for renewal. The second is to assess or do a cost benefit analysis. So while Microsoft is increasing the prices, they are also stating the fact, the reason behind the increase in prices is because they're enhancing the product functionality. So the enterprise customers need to understand what are these enhanced product features or functionalities, and do they eventually need them? If yes, of course there'll be a bill that they need to kind of put in. But if not, then they can probably ask Microsoft to continue using the same product and not increase the prices. Lastly, what they can do is not negotiate only for Microsoft Dynamics product, but negotiate from a stronger point, which essentially means that negotiate for the entire business that they have with Microsoft and not just product wise negotiations. And these levers not only work with Microsoft, these are universal levers which would work with almost all major software providers, right? So Rahul, what are some of the areas that you would recommend software enterprise customers to be wary of when it comes to outsourcing contracts?
So interestingly, though there is a lot of focus from the buyer side to preserve the value that they're deriving from the outsourcing arrangement, as well as from the savings that they're realizing, we continue to see there's, in a lot of cases, sustained value leakage in the outsourcing contracts. And the reasons for that are frequently, not just, let's say, high or expensive rate cards, but various other factors. If you kind of list the different sources of leakage, these include, first of all, inefficient solution sizing. So either the number of people deployed by the service provider is very high, and ultimately it's a client who ends up paying for those people, or it could be because within the team that is working for a particular client, the pyramids are not optimized. There is more presence of the middle layer or the senior layers of the pyramid. The shoring mix sometimes may not be optimal. Not as much leverage of offshore as compared to the current market norms. The location strategy itself. So, for example, tier 2, tier 3 locations are now being used in a lot of IT and BPO deals, but there are still contracts, where there is simply no leverage of tier 2 and tier 3 locations. And this could be tier 2, tier 3 locations in offshore countries. These could be tier 2 or tier 3 locations in onshore countries. Irrespective, there has been a trend towards greater adoption of such kind of cities, but in various contracts we do not see that happening yet. The pricing itself, like we earlier talked about, can be suboptimal. The rate cards could be higher, or the fee components can be on the higher side. Like, for example, very high PMO charges or very high transition and transformation charges that were agreed upon at the beginning of the deal. There's also a very important element of what is the productivity improvement that a provider is able to bring to the table, from year 1 to year 5. And this is essentially a combination of operational productivity improvements, also known as continuous improvements, as well as some of the digital and transformation-led productivity improvements. And finally, there could be some terms and conditions which impose very high costs, implicitly for the clients. For example, high COLA adjustment year on year, or foreign exchange benefits not getting passed on adequately. So there are various such sources where value can leak out. We generally find that in second generation contracts, the leakage could be anywhere between 30 to 42% of the TCV. In third generation contracts, generally we find it to be a bit on the lower side, somewhere between 22 to 32. But even here, it's pretty meaningful, pretty substantial, especially keeping in mind that when you are talking about a third generation contract, there are not too many levers that you can essentially pull in order to get more savings. And hence, we have seen that over the last 12 months, a lot of the clients have been pushing towards doing not just vanilla rate card benchmarking, but a comprehensive assessment of the relationship and the contract that they have with a particular service provider, and trying to uncover all the areas which can be optimized uh, to kind of get better value and better savings. Okay. Moving ahead, I think one important point also is to keep in mind, how to kind of look at quality and how it has evolved over the last few years. So, Shitika, what's your take on that?
Absolutely, Rahul. Today, in fact, we are witnessing a significant evolution in how service quality is measured and managed. While the traditional SLAs focused on operation metrics like response time, uptime are crucial, we are seeing the focus to now also grow towards actual user experiences and having a structured metrics around the same. There has to be a measurement mechanism, fee associated, so on and so forth. So this generally helps ensure that the service delivery aligns with your real business needs and the user expectations, which then leads to more meaningful outcomes and a stronger partnership in place. Business and user experience aligned matrices like reduction in the time to market. It could be the change in NPS score or meeting to a certain criteria. Deployment success rate are now not uncommon to see being contracted for. And also by adopting XLAs, providers have this opportunity to demonstrate a strong commitment to improving client experiences, building better relationships, and a way of standing out in a cutthroat competition market that is there as we speak. So now, having spoken about the need for adoption of these XLAs, it becomes imperative to also talk about the need for a clear communication mechanism in place. Because with these kind of transition, the stakeholder accountability, transparency, the overall evolved experience becomes very, very crucial. So yeah, with that, Abhishek, I know you have a point of view on how best to go about doing the same in terms of the right approach to adoption. And would you like to talk a bit about that?
Sure, sure, Shatika. And like you rightly said, XLA as a concept is not something new, right? Providers have often pitched XLAs as a differentiator in their deal responses, but more and more what we are now seeing is organizations attach a tangible value to the XLAs. Uh, no longer are they happy with just seeing a whole laundry list of XLAs which are like good to have and may be measured, may not be measured. Now, having said that, let's look at one example of where we saw XLAs actually being deployed in an engagement. Uh, the example is effectively of a large paper manufacturer, which was essentially a fourth generation outsourcing arrangement. And this engagement was with their incumbent provider itself. Now, the approach that the provider and the enterprise aligned on was a phase-wise approach rather than, doing a big bang that right off the bat, they'll implement 10, 15 XLA metrics and link it to business outcomes. As you can see on the screen, right, across the 5 years of their engagement, they essentially followed a phase-wise approach wherein initially they went ahead with introducing certain XLAs in place of the existing SLAs which were there. And once those XLAs were stabilized and started to get measured in the appropriate manner, then they started linking some of them to certain business outcomes. So, having said that, again, would like to reiterate on the point that uh, the ideal way to do it, and what we have seen resonate with enterprises also, is essentially follow a phase-wise approach in terms of not just identifying the XLAs, but also on how you plan to implement them. And the mutual way is the best way, wherein the enterprise and the provider effectively sit together and figure out which areas to target, which business metrics to associate it with. Now, having said that, that effectively brings us to our next part of the engagement, which is the call to action. And now what we've seen is, like, given the current market dynamics and the increased pressure on finding ways and means to derive maximum value of each and every engagement that the enterprises are in, uh, what we would want to offer is the enterprise stakeholders can essentially sign up for a complimentary price check, which would essentially allow you to gauge some of your current engagements against the market benchmarks and try and figure out how best to achieve further value. Now, to sign up, essentially, you can just click on the link, which is now available in the chat window. Uh, Once you click on the link, you would have a option of choosing between the three available functions. So effectively your IT applications or finance and accounting or contact center as one of the functions. And within that particular function, you can choose two roles, any of the two roles which are there. Now, once you've chosen the roles, you essentially have an option of selecting two of the six countries mentioned for which we would provide the benchmarks. Now, once we receive the final details, subsequently we would get back to you with the complimentary price check for it. Uh, I believe, Rahul, over to you to walk us through the final stages of the call.
Yeah. Thanks, Abhishek, and thank you, Udit and Shitika, for sharing all the insights and observations. Now, moving on to the Q&A section, we have received a number of questions during the presentation, as well as some were received prior to the presentation as well. We'll spend the next few minutes to try and answer some of those. Shitika, I think perhaps the first one you would like to take up. The question is, how will Gen AI affect outsourcing?
Sure, Rahul. So there are many touch points beyond productivity gain. I know the entire conversation, or in fact, the major kind of conversation is typically around the productivity gains that are there to be achieved. But where an impact can be there, it can be followed by multiple aspects. So, without going into the exact quantifiable details at the moment, we are seeing the impact to be there, right from legal challenges and guardrails to optimizing the pricing strategy to including Gen AI's efficiency enhancement into the overall solutioning to pyramid transformation due to reduction in the workload at, say, L1 and L2 for specific functions, and then many more aspects associated to this. Then there are also some key operational considerations with respect to the infrastructure requirement, data privacy, which are all being accounted for when contracting for services now. So as we speak, there's an evolution in the ways of sourcing for services now, and in fact, our utility on impact checklist comes handy if one is looking to evaluate some of these parameters in detail. But for now, I hope I've answered the question. Rahul, we can probably take the next one.
Yes. So the next question is, what is the impact on talent availability because of changes in demand for outsourcing? So I can take this question. So we see a clear correlation between the changed demand for outsourcing and the talent availability situation. If we take a step back and look at how the situation was, let's say in 2022, at the height of the Great Resignation, uh, demand was booming for almost each and every IT and BPO service, across any skill set that one can consider. And to gear up for that demand, providers were trying to hire people. Frequently, they were hiring people from each other, leading to a merry-go-round, essentially, people moving from one organization to the other and then to the other. And essentially, there was a very big gap, between the demand for talent and the supply. However, as of now, the muted demand for outsourcing services has led us to a situation where organizations are primarily hiring only for some advanced skill sets where there is growing demand. For example, cloud migration, cybersecurity services, analytics, generative AI. We do see constrained availability of resources for these areas. But for traditional areas such as programming in Java, or testing, or on the BPO side, accounts payable, accounts receivable, on the infrastructure side, server management, storage management, there is very little hiring that is currently going on, and there is sufficient availability of talent. So as of now, the situation is that for some of the really in-demand next-gen skills, there is still constrained availability, but for all others, it's a pretty eased out situation. Okay, looking at the next question. Okay, does outcome-based pricing really reduce TCO for a client? Abhishek, you want to take a stab at that?
Yep, sure, Rahul. Yeah, so right off the bat, yes, in most of the cases, outcome-based pricing will have an impact on reducing the overall TCO of a client. However, it is important to not just look at TCO reduction in terms of outcome-based pricing, but also look at it from the lens of business value generation. So effectively, the outcome-based models are designed in such a way to enhance the business value for the clients, right? If we take a simple example and a very straightforward one, think about an application where you're supporting, and effectively reduced application downtime as an outcome will directly lead to, let's say, more transactions using your application, which essentially will lead to increased revenue for the client. So not just TCO reduction, but then outcome-based pricing will also enable business value generation.
Okay. We've got just a minute left. One final question I'll take up, which is, how is offshore pricing expected to trend over the next 12 months? So we'll not get into the details of this, but I just wanted to tell the audience that we do have a publication known as Pricing Index, and you could kind of go to our website and download the report. Right now the report that we have is a slightly older version, but in the next 1 or 2 weeks we'll be releasing the H1 2024 version for the updated pricing trends and the outlook going ahead. With that, we are at the end of the Q&A. One final message for our audience is that, you could also go to our website to see our perspective on some of the emerging topics when it comes to the outsourcing space. So, a lot of blogs we keep on publishing, and, you'd find those blogs to be pretty useful on the emerging areas. With that, we are at the end of the webinar. Thank you everybody for attending it, and have a good day ahead.